Thank you for such a very kind introduction. So this talk today is drawn from a larger project on diaspora Koreans in China, Japan, and the United States. When I started this project, I actually did not intend to focus at all on the military. I was thinking more about the sort of indirect effects that the military has socially and culturally, the effect it has on pushing migration and so forth. But what I found was several of my life history narrators had very interesting experiences with the military, particularly in terms of having been a soldier in more than one nation or more than one empire's military. And timely enough, it reminds me of the Korean film that just came out, My Way, which is a fictionalized version of one such life story. So the people that I'm going to talk about today range from ethnic Koreans in China, Joseonjuk, and Korean Americans. And their experiences include sort of being witnesses and in some ways victims of the Korean War and or participants in the military in the 1940s to the 1950s. So one such gentleman, Mr. Moon, who was born in 1926 and passed away some years after I interviewed him in 2006, was born and raised in Pyeongando in what is now North Korea, from a rice farming family. They were not poor, but they weren't rich either. He volunteered for the Japanese military in the summer of 1943 because he was going to be drafted anyway in a few years, and he wanted to lessen his father's burden of having to pay for his schooling. He was about 17 or 18 at that time, and supporting him at school required at least 15 won a month just for his food expenses, at a time when a bag of rice garnered a mere 1 won and 50 chun. So this was not a tenable financial arrangement. He went to Pyongyang, took an exam, and entered the Boys Air Force School. From there, he went to Japan and trained at a series of Air Force schools and became an airplane mechanic. In late spring, he's sent to his first post, an air base in Japan. He's there only for about 2 or 3 months when Japan surrenders, right? And his unit ends up calling all the Koreans to one particular spot, and from there they end up taking a ship to Korea. He doesn't return to his hometown until the following year, about February or so. Okay. So he talks about how he first heard about Japan's surrender and Korea's liberation, but says that he was just a bit too numb for all of that. He calls himself, in this clip that I'm going to play for you, a Japanese collaborator, and says that this is how people would view him, and talks about how, strangely enough, he talks about being a Japanese collaborator or, knowing that people would view him that way, and then segs almost immediately into talking about the big to-do that his enlistment caused in his hometown. He was the first Korean in his hometown to enlist voluntarily, right? And that enlistment was taken as an act of patriotism. And it was shown, his going away was turned into a kind of celebration. And what that did, in effect, was to allay suspicions of his hometowns and his family's political loyalties. Right? So if I can figure out how to work this.
그러니까 이제 일본이 항복한다고 하는 전황태야가 항복한다고 하는 그 소식을 그 자리에서 라디오를 듣고 알았어요. 그때 기분이 어떠셨어요? 그때 나는 몰랐는데 별로 좀 덤덤한데 그 옆에 있는 하사가 하나가 있다가 나는 지금은 명시인데 그때 우리 상식애령 하는 거는 1월 날짜 달월자 일본말로 읽으면 희석인데 희석이 정도는 좋겠다. 조선은 독립하는데 이와 같은 얘기를 먼저 친구가 하는 얘기는 들었는데 그때는 그저 전부 섭섭하다. 그래서 일본이 망했다. 한다는 거 망했다고 하는 것보다는 독립한다고 하니까 기분이 그래도 조금 다르잖아요. 나는 뭐 독립운동을 한 사람도 아니고 요즘 말로 얘기가 되면 친일분자인데 그런 거는 모르고 지났지요. 그래서 덤덤하게 지났지요.
그 장로님께서 그때 친일분자였다고 하실 때 그게 무슨 말씀이세요?
아니 친일분자라고 하는 거는 해방되고 난 다음에 북한 쪽에 가게 되면은 남한에서는 그래도 일본 육군사관학교가 뭐 어디 출신이 하더라도 까딱 없는데 이북에서는 일본 서면 비행병학교에 지원해 갔기 때문에 나는 징병도 아니고 그저 징병을 가야 되는데 아버지 고생 덜 시키기 위해서 군대에 이제 들어간 건데 어차피 죽을 바에는 아버지 고생이나 덜 시키고 세상 죽어버리자 하는 식으로 이제 간 건데도 그땐 군대를 가게 되면 모두 다 죽음을 과거하고 있지 않았어요? 그러니까 죽던지 살던지 한번 나가서 보자. 그래가지고서 미리 아버지하고는 의논도 안 하고 이제 군대에 들어간 거예요. 그게 되니까 순환중학교에서는 처음 군대에 나가니까 요즘 말로 하면 요란한 거예요. 그 시골 바닥에다가 갑자기 이제 군대에서 지원병마가 이제 소년비행병 학교 간다 그러니까 뭐 동네에서는 동네세대로 학교에서는 학교세대로 장행해라 이래가지고서 요란이 다 열어주고 요즘 말로 정말 국민학교 학생들까지 정부장까지 이제 만세 불러주면서 길바닥까지 다 늘어서서 도열해가지고 나를 환송해줬어요. 처음 일본 군대에 들어가니까. 그러니까 학교는 학교대로 나로 인해서 결과적으로 사상적으로 일본 사람들이 의심이 풀어졌지요. 군대 지원에 들어가니까 이렇게까지 잘해주는구나 이래가지고서. 그러니까 그때 순환에 조그만 신사도 했었는데 신사 참배 가고 정거장까지 뭐다 나를 환송하려고 길바닥 양편을 서가지고서 히스키 만세 부르면서 모두 이렇게 다 지나가는 거예요. 하니까 이제
So, in this rather long passage, there's really quite a lot going on here, right? And not least because, he's taking time out from his narrative to tell me background information about how and why his name became Hizuki, right? But I want to take a look first at his expressions of national loyalty, right? He says his first reaction to hearing about Japan's surrender is disappointment, right? So, 섭섭하다. It's not quite disappointment, it's disappointment, regret, a feeling of sort of being sorry, right? So, why does he feel this way? He doesn't explain himself, of course, right? But this is his first reaction, he says. And then to hear his sort of colleague, right, his military colleague, say to him, "Wow, you must be happy. 좋겠다." And he says, "Well, that to think about, well, first Japan lost, that makes it sound one way, and now to think about, oh, well, Korea is liberated, Joseon is independent, that puts a whole different spin on things, right?" But even in his recollection, it's quite clear that he doesn't quite know how to grasp this, right? How is he supposed to deal with this? And so he describes himself as being just 덤덤하다, right? So, feeling nothing, kind of numb, right? So emotionless, right? This other soldier, this Japanese soldier, thinks that Mr. Moon should be rejoicing, right? But he's not, right? What does this do? Not only does it kind of throw Mr. Moon into a kind of confusion about how he should feel, and therefore he retreats into feeling nothing, it also has the effect of pointing out, well, you're not one of us. Your name might be Hijiki, right? But you're not Japanese like us. We're the ones that lost. You didn't lose. You were liberated, right? What does this do? Perhaps if the circumstances had been different and he had been in a circle of other Koreans or he'd been in his hometown, the affect that swirled around him might have been different. but he's not. He's in Japan. He's still near Japanese air. He's in a Japanese air base. He's in a Japanese home with other Japanese soldiers. His first feeling really is a kind of alienation or isolation, right? And then he says, as if to explain, right, why he's not feeling the way he's supposed to feel, apparently, he says, well, I wasn't an independence fighter or anything like that. Actually, according to what people would say now, I was a collaborator, right? So, I just didn't feel anything. In other words, even then, in 1945, there's really no room politically for people like him, right? Who doesn't have much politics, who really, whether it's Japan that's has the reins of power or Korea's Yangband that has the reins of power, it's, half a dozen of one, six of the other. He has certain kinds of feelings about being Korean, but not necessarily fierce, passionate nationalist independence loyalties. He has sympathies, kind of affinity to Japan. A lot of what he experienced came through Japan and is sort of Japanese in origin. But he doesn't really feel that he belongs to Japan either, right? So he's already, right, in this limbo, right? I really can't blame him for retreating into, I'm just feeling tumdumhe, right? And when I ask him why he calls himself a collaborator, right? I mean, he didn't do anything really to collaborate. He doesn't talk about his experience with the military. He doesn't say, well, I'm a collaborator because I fought for the Japanese military, right? Instead, he talks about his enlistment, right? It was the voluntary act of enlistment, right? And in some ways, the way in which the town and the local Japanese authorities responded to it, that in his mind has became connected to collaboration, right? And he makes a clear distinction about how this action was viewed before and after independence and geographically in the North versus in the South, right? So something that in the South is kind of run-of-the-mill, doesn't get much of a reaction, and before independence was praised, right? After independence becomes suspect, and in the North is, in his mind, something that would really be to be targeted, right? And he stresses that he went and volunteered not out of patriotic loyalty or any of that kind of thing or politics, but because his father was literally breaking his back trying to send him to school. He thought, I'm going to be drafted if I'm going to die anyway. I might as well die a little bit earlier, right? And release my father from this particular financial burden, right? In other words, why study so hard? Why invest in himself, right, when he's going to die anyway in a few years? So this is actually a point that he makes a number of times in our interviews. I would say that in this first interview, he made this point probably 3 times, right? And quite emphatically, right? So the way that I read this, right, is that at the time it was a kind of despair and resignation in the face of what he saw as sure death, right, and a sort of final act of honoring and helping out his father. Right? When he enlisted, he received a enlistment bonus, I guess you would call it, of about 201, which is a huge, huge amount of money at that time. It would have bought a very large, very fine ox, for example, and had money left over. And he gave this all to his father, right? And he talks about this and says, well, father wasn't actually very pleased. Father was kind of pissed off that I enlisted without telling him, and father was pissed off that I thought I could just fob off this money on him in place of his son. But I felt that father just didn't understand my position, that I didn't feel that I could keep on being a financial burden to the family in this way. So his enlistment in the Japanese military actually got two reactions he didn't really expect. One was the anger from his father, and the other was the sort of the celebration, right, from his town. A celebration that, in a later conversation, which we didn't record, it was just a casual conversation, he said, well, actually, no, it all seemed kind of surreal at the time and a little bit fake. And I felt like a fake because they were ascribing these things to me that I wasn't feeling at the time. Right? But if it meant that the Japanese police were going to let up on the townspeople for a while, well then, that was okay with him. Right? Now, he arrives in his hometown in February of 1946, right? And he farms with his father, and he gets married at some point. And then, at some point, he's not clear on the date exactly, he joins the North Korean People's Army. Right? Not even just casually. He's picked to be one of the founding soldiers by the Communist Party of his village. Right? And he finds this kind of, even in recollection, kind of astonishing. Like, why is this happening to me? But he decides, no, I have to go. I have to do this because, again, it's about allaying political suspicions. Right? So I'll play this.
나는 노란 날에는 또 이거 옛날 얘기지만은 이북에서 그 46년에 이북 군대를 뽑아가는데 인민군 창설하는데 창설을 하는 사병영으로 뽑혀갔어요. 그 사병영으로 뽑혀갔는데 내가 사상적으로는 일본 벌써 징병은 21살 돼야 뽑아가는데 지원병으로 가서 18살에 일본 지원병 했지요. 그 다음에 지원병 하니까 이북 사람들이 볼 적에 있어서는 친일분자입니까? 지원병으로 일본 군대 갔다가 또 안식교회 우리 동네 교회를 나가고 하니까 사상이 나빠요. 그래가지고서 이북 군대에 들어갔는데 이북 군대에서 남들은 벌써 뭐 6개월 지나게 되면은 계급이 조금씩 절동해서 한 계급, 두 계급씩 올라가는데 나는 계급을 올려줄 생각을 안 하는 거예요.
So, he actually stays in this North Korean army only for 6 months, right? And he really has a hard time with this. He's not happy with the military life, and interestingly enough, he complained quite a lot about how undisciplined and how shoddy the North Korean army was compared to the Japanese. Right? He was saying that the Japanese were so disciplined, and they had, they really knew how to do the training and so forth, and they're so tough and rigorous. The North Koreans, with their idea of training was, march forward, march backward, turn around, march forward, march backward, turn around. He thought that was kind of just, ridiculous. And so he needs to get out of this military, right? He can't stand this. And so what does he do? He ends up deserting, right? Not only does he not like the military, he's also not being promoted, right? So clearly, even though he's trying to escape this, collaborator baggage, it's not working. Everybody else is being promoted, but he's not. And he ends up deserting, right? But deserting in kind of a weird way. It's kind of unclear whether or not he had permission to leave the unit and go back to his village, because back in his village he was put to work training sort of teenagers in military maneuvers, right? So was he deserting, or had he been reassigned? It's not quite clear. But one day the Communist Party calls him up and says they want to talk to him, and so he's like, oh, so this is it. They've decided that I've deserted, so I'm going to be in trouble. And from then on, he begins to act like a crazy person, right? He pretends he's mentally ill, right? And does all kinds of weird things in public and gets out of control. And he's apparently such a good actor that his father is fooled, right? And is really distraught and talks about, well, we know this so-and-so who had a mental illness, and we sent him to such and such place, and he got better, so we should send you there. right? And he has quite a time convincing his father that actually, no, father, this is just an act because I'm trying to avoid punishment from the Communist Party. And he has a cousin who has been going back and forth doing potare jangsa between the South and the North, right? He goes to the South and buys things like parts for radios and like various kinds of electronic parts and sells them in the North. And that cousin is scheduled to be leaving to go across the border pretty soon, so he goes with his cousin, and he leaves for the South. He takes a train from Pyongyang to the border, and from that border, he and the cousin walk the rest of the way. So this is in about 1948, and a few months before the Korean War breaks out, his wife joins him in Seoul. Right? So his family is still up the north, but his wife is now in Seoul. What happens to him in Seoul, however, is he's an able-bodied young man. Right? He might be married, but he has no children as of yet. Right? He and his wife eventually have 4 children, but at this point, he has no children. So what happens? Okay. The Korean War is about to break out, then the Korean War does break out, and he gets drafted into the South Korean army. And he becomes an ordnance officer. He's in charge of the explosives, right? He serves out the war. Because of his training as an airplane mechanic, he becomes an army mechanic, and he's discharged in 1956. Right? In this time, he and his wife have 4 children, and then the next decade, in 1967, she passes away. She dies. Right? A year later, actually, it might have been 2 years later, he marries a nurse, right? And so by this time, it's 1968, 1969. Immigration in the United States is opened up. Nurses are prime candidates for immigration, and they could bring over their family, right? So she is a nurse. She applies for a job in the United States, and she takes her husband and his 4 children with her to the States, right? And so this is where I met them. I met them when he was living in Georgia, in the northeast corner of Georgia, outside of Atlanta. Now, so what's interesting about Mr. Moon is that he's a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is another reason why he was a suspect in North Korea. And he becomes an elder in his church in Georgia. He lives out his life there with his 4 children. His children, one became a lawyer, one became a doctor. I forget what the other 2 did. The thing that his wife and his children remember the most about him, and the reason that his wife and children came to me and said, "Oh, I hear you're interviewing Korean Americans and immigrants. You should interview my husband. You should interview my father," was because he had the military experience in Japan. Right? Because he had spent a lot of time talking to his children about that experience. Right? He didn't talk much about the Korean War. He didn't talk much about the early days of being an immigrant. He didn't even talk that much about, his life in Pyeongang-do on the family rice farm. It was his life in the Japanese military. Right? It was the rigor of it, the discipline of it, how it was so different from what he had grown up to know, and how, contrary to what people thought, in his view, the Japanese were actually quite even-handed, right? Although, he said, there was always an undercurrent of, you're not really one of us, but he felt that in the military, they bent over backwards to be fair, right? Now, this is in stark contrast to one of my life narratives from China, Mr. Kim. I don't have a clip of him, primarily because the audio is so terrible, and he's such a heavy accent, I don't think you would be able to understand him. But Mr. Kim really had nothing good to say about the Japanese military. Right? And he thought that they were just brutal, that they were too harsh, that they were always looking for punishment, that the Koreans were always punished the worst, and that they were, just thoroughly discriminatory from start to finish. This is not the way a society should be organized at all, right? I thought about, oh, why would this difference be? What's the difference here, right? Mr. Kim was just an ordinary soldier, right? Kind of a, a grunt, right? Mr. Moon, on the other hand, was a very well-educated and fairly well-valued airplane mechanic, right? Even though he says he had not necessarily done all that well academically in school, he apparently had a real knack for mechanics. He aced every test they ever put in front of him, right? And this is why he kept on going to training school after training school instead of being immediately sent to some base or sent out to fighting, right? So the class difference within the military of being a rather elite, well-trained and valued mechanic versus a untrained, unskilled, plain old grunt, I think accounts for some of this difference in the way that they evaluate the military, right? Well, Mr. Kim, I asked him, well, so were you in the Korean War, right? Did you fight for the People's Volunteer Army during the war? He said, no, not for that, right? He said, no, actually, I went around trying to avoid that. I went from place to place hiding to avoid being in that war because I had been in the Japanese military, and that experience was just so horrible. I had no desire to repeat it with any other military whatsoever. Right? And he talks about this in this quote that I translated for you. He had just had to go. And he was stationed somewhere north, where he was bossed around by the Japanese, and then he did some kind of service work in that local village for 8 months. And even though he wanted to run away, he just couldn't because the Japanese were so fearsome. He was so scared of them, right? And in that middle of training, right, toward the end of this training, liberation came, right? And then he returned home by walking the whole way, right, from somewhere in the north of Korea to northeastern China, right, Manchuria. It's also instructive to note that Mr. Moon talks about liberation as the Japanese surrender, right? 일본이 많았을 때. He doesn't really talk about it as 관복절 or as the day that Joseon was liberated. Right? Mr. Kim, on the other hand, never referred to it as the Japanese surrender. He always referred to it as Joseon 독립. This is the day that Joseon was liberated. Right? Part of it comes, I think, from the sort of difference in their life experiences after the Korean War and their different lives in South Korea and America versus a life in China. Right? So there's another gentleman from China, Mr. Lee, who he did fight in the Korean War. He was drafted into the Chinese People's Volunteer Army in 1950. Right? And he joined the Chinese advance into Korea. Didn't go as far as Daegu. He stayed in the north. And when the Chinese army retreated all the way back into China, he stayed in the north. He married a local northern woman, and he went to work for a North Korea government media office. Right? He had, he says, a fairly comfortable life there. His children went to good schools. He was living in Pyongyang, so he was one of the, the better off in that society. In the 1970s, he came back, pretty empty-handed, with his wife and children, and he wouldn't tell me what happened. He just said, oh, time to move, so we all just came back. I thought to myself, well, you came back, but your wife and children weren't coming back. They were coming here for the first time. So what really happened? And despite a little bit of prodding here and there, he wouldn't talk about it. And he actually didn't really talk a lot about his army experience or his time in North Korea either. And so I suspect that, and I don't have any proof, of course, but I suspect that what happened was he kind of got caught up peripherally in one of those purges that North Korea engaged in, where North Korea had this habit of bringing in ethnic Koreans from the Soviet Union or from China and having them work in various kind of expert positions, even letting them rise as high as various kinds of policy advisors. And then at some point having this purge and kicking them all out. And they did this like 3 or 4 times repeatedly during the 60s and 70s. And I suspect that even though he wasn't necessarily that high up, that he sort of was collateral damage in one of those purges, and that's why he won't talk about it. Now, with these men, military participation was not at all a path to any kind of real citizenship or community or belonging, right? And I want to point this out because in a U.S. context in particular, right, the military is held out as this has been historically a path for minorities and immigrants to prove their loyalty to the United States, to their country, and to gain not just legal paper citizenship, but actual, real, genuine recognition as citizens, right, belonging to the nation. Right? This is one reason, for example, why Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II, on the basis of really no evidence, were so adamant, for the most part, that they be allowed to go and fight for the United States in World War II, because they thought, well, you know, if we shed our blood for this country, then the country will know that we're not disloyal. This is the only way that we can prove our loyalty. Right? So in U.S. history in particular, right, but in other national histories as well, the connection between military participation and genuine citizenship is seen to be very strong. Right? These stories, though, they're not strong at all. Right? In fact, in some ways, military participation actually weakens all kinds of national links. It weakens all kinds of connections to government authorities, be they nation states or empires or, you know, fledgling, emerging, unstable nation states, right? You know, so the participation in the military is kind of held up as a device that's supposed to help you get acceptance, right? Remember for Mr. Moon, it's supposed to help him and the villagers escape suspicion from the Japanese. It's supposed to help him and his family escape suspicion from North Korea. So it's supposed to play this kind of a role, but it doesn't, right? It ultimately fails, right? And so in part maybe because there is this hope held out, the failure of this is sort of reinforces some of this alienation, right? For Mr. Kim and Mr. Lee in China, their military experience is onerous, right? It doesn't lead to anything in particular, right? And in part, it's because for these men, the historical circumstances are so confusing, right, and so politically charged that whoever they're fighting for, whoever they're with, it always ends up being the wrong side, right? Fortunes change, right? So it was good at one time to be with the Japanese, but then now it's not, right? And for the ethnic Koreans in China, you know, they're fighting for Korea, yes, but they're fighting in the Chinese military. They're not Korean citizens of any Korean nation state. They're Chinese citizens. They're ethnically Korean, but so where does this, right? It's kind of the classic migrant diasporic dilemma, right? Where do you belong, right? Nobody really seems to have a clear sense of this, right? And even though today we talk about, oh, you can belong to all of them, right? It's post-colonial, it's hybridity, it's cosmopolitan. It's enriching to have more than one identity. You belong to multiple communities, and you can belong to multiple nation states, and it's all wonderful. Well, it's not so wonderful, actually, right? On the nitty-gritty ground of it, it's very confusing, personally, but also it leaves you open to attack from all sides, right? Because if you belong everywhere, the corollary of that is you belong nowhere, right? And the way that the military experience for these men work out, it really shows, I think, the truth of that. And so, you know, another way of saying this is that the governmental apparatus of belonging, right? Whether it's belonging as a subject to an empire or as a citizen to a nation state, right? It's fundamentally unable to accommodate the needs, the experiences, the circumstances, the emotions of these men, right? Empires ostensibly allow multiple loyalties because you can be loyal governmentally to the empire and loyal culturally to your particular tribal, right, group. But that doesn't necessarily work out, right? In the end, if the needs of your particular group and the empire collide, then you're supposed to choose the empire, right? From the empire's point of view. But from your people's point of view, you're supposed to choose the people. So you're still kind of stuck, right? For a nation state, nation states, as they emerged, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, really placed a premium on homogeneity, right? So much so that they would create myths about homogeneity, right? The nation state was supposed to be ethnically, culturally, linguistically homogeneous. Never mind that the history doesn't bear that out, right? They would create this, right? And so people like Mr. Moon, if he stays in South Korea, he has to deny his North Korean past or refute it somehow, right? He goes to America, he has to figure out some way to prove that he has thrown away his Koreanness enough to become, you know, a true red-blooded American. None of this is going to happen, right? Mr. Moon was talking about, actually talking with my father, not to me, but I was over eavesdropping, how, you know, how can you deny your whole past, that you grew up in the North, and that the North is your hometown? Right? That doesn't work. And then, you know, that he said, you know, and the Americans are even sillier, he said, because they're like, you know, they want you to pretend that you're a white person. Well, anybody can see I'm not a white person, right? So anybody can see that, you know, I'm not your typical American. So what does it gain me to try to say that, you know, I'm not American, or that I'm not really Korean, that I'm more American than I'm Korean, right? So these are the kinds of questions that these men continue to ask throughout their lives, but these are questions that predate their migration, and it predates the migration because of the particular sort of complex history of the Korean Peninsula in the mid-20th century. So now I want to talk about civilians, right? For civilians, especially for women, the military was actually both more fearsome and more distant, right? But it was also, just as much for the men who were soldiers, the military was a force for disjuncture, right? So Mrs. Lee came from a rural town in northern Korea, fairly close to 30th parallel. And she was a very, very smart young woman, and went to study nursing in China, learned English, learned Mandarin, learned to speak Japanese. She was multilingual. When World War II ended, she was in China with her husband and 2 children. And she wasn't clear on exactly why it was, but her husband wasn't able to leave. He was still being held up by the Japanese for some reason. And so they decided that she and the 2 children would go back to their hometown first, right? So she boards a train in Beijing, headed for Tianjin. But before it arrives in Tianjin, the train stops. And I'm going to play you this tape.
근데 가족분이 지금 중국의 공산당이에요. 가족분이 중국의 공산당이에요. 근데 그 가족분들이 군복을 다 입고 그걸로 와서 조사하는 거예요. 그다음에 뺏어서 다 뺏어서 다 차 문 밖으로 던지고 그래서 다 채취를 하는데 I was only one Korean 그렇지 않아요. 근데 제일 기차 대가리에 있는 칸이.
So there were at least 3 salient features in this quote, right? One is her very strong identification of the the Palogun, the 8th Route Army, first as the Army of the Chinese People, and then as the Chinese Communist Party. Right? And along with that is the image that she invokes of the uniformed soldiers, right? 군복을 탁 입고, right? That expression is one of, they're wearing this uniform, like snappy, with pride, right? And they're an impressive sight, right? And they're also just a little bit fearsome because their purpose is to inspect the passengers and the baggage. And so there's a panic when they arrive. Everybody is throwing things out the window, right? Thinking that when the soldiers go away, they'll go out and they'll try to retrieve it, or even if they lose it, it's better than being caught with it and punished. Right? And she notices, I'm the only Korean on this train. Right? There might be other Koreans. There could well have been, right? But if so, she hasn't seen them, and so she feels very isolated, very alone on this crowded train full of presumably Chinese. And she's not afraid, or she's afraid of being mistaken for a Japanese woman. Because she thinks that apparently she doesn't look Chinese enough to pass the Chinese. And if she's caught as a Japanese woman, then she's going to be beaten, she's going to be raped, she's going to be taken away somewhere. Things will be bad for her, right? So what this tells us is that, at least in her mind, Koreans in this area are pretty rare. Right? Never mind that Koreans are all over Bukgando, the Manchuria area. They really haven't penetrated, apparently, as far as Beijing. Right? So she is very aware of this. And notice that she says only one Korean, right? In English, right? So why would this be? Right? She is a person who, despite her many decades of life in the United States, almost never used English in her interviews with me. Right? She always used Korean. So it was actually quite shocking to have her come up with this Korean, with this English in the middle of all this Korean. Why would that be? Okay. So this is a case really of contemporary circumstances arcing backwards, right, to kind of twist history. When she's interviewing with me, it's already, right, it's been 50 plus years of national division. Right? At the time of this train incident, she would have identified herself as a Joseon saram, right? But by the time she's interviewing me, many, many decades later, Joseon is the term used for North Korea, right? North Korea's name is Joseon, right? And she would have identified herself as a Hanguk saram, right? A South Korean. But she can't really call herself a South Korean, a Hanguk saram, talking about this context, because that's not what she remembers herself being, right? I sort of suspect that she probably wanted to say Joseon saram, but then switched over to the comparatively neutral Korean. Right? Despite being, because it's a foreign word, it glosses over all of the internal politics that have come up that make it difficult to call yourself a Joseon person or a Hanguk person in any given situation, right? It got so bad that at one point, reunification activists, students, called themselves Joseon Hanguk saram, right? Which is kind of ridiculous. And then so in this encounter, what does she do, right? She goes on to talk about how, she's afraid of being mistaken for a Japanese woman, and she just seizes the moment, right? She does the exact opposite of what everybody else is doing around her, right? So maybe she thought, I'm the only Korean anyway, I might as well stand out even more, right? She takes her bags off the shelf, opens them all up, puts them out on display, and waits for the soldiers to come. And when they come, she talks to them in Mandarin and says, how are you? I'm a Korean woman. I'm traveling with my 2 children. I'm trying to go back home to Korea. Here's my luggage. Do what you want with it. Right? And she says the soldiers looked at her, looked at the bags, and then closed all the bags. They didn't even go through, they just looked, right? Closed all the bags, put them back up, and said, this train doesn't go to Pyongyang. You do know that, don't you? It only goes to Tianjin. Right? So have a safe journey. And they left. right? And she was so relieved, right? And she recounts the story as sort of an example of it's better to face your problems up front, right? Kind of seize it and own it rather than trying to avoid it. When she finally does get to her hometown and she meets with her parents and siblings, it's less than ideal. Her parents, they're all suspect because they're Christian, again, Seventh-day Adventists, and they own land, most of which they lose under land reform over the next few years, right? Then the war breaks out, and things get even worse, right? And because she knows English, right, when the U.S. military unit kind of passes by on its advance up north, she takes a job as a translator, and this brings in, some income to help her out in raising her family. One day, the commander asks her to go with the unit back across the 38th to the south. They would take a boat, land in Incheon, and be there for a few days and then come back. And he says, no, don't worry about things. It's kind of it's quiet right now. The border's not going to close. We'll be there, and come right back. And so she agrees and goes, right? But the day after they cross over, intense fighting breaks out. The border closes. She never gets back. She never again sees her 3 children. She never again sees her husband. She never sees her parents, never sees her siblings, right? And decades later, even when through the Red Cross and through other things, Korean Americans from the North are reaching out and finding their lost relatives in the North, she never does that, right? And she told me very specifically, that she never did that because I was an army translator. I was a translator for the enemy, right? And I don't want the North Korean authorities to know that my children have such a mother. Otherwise, they might face some kind of repercussions. Right? So in the South, she was trained as a nurse, so she goes to work as a nurse. She uses her church and missionary contacts to get a job. She has increasing experiences with the military, right? As a nurse, she works in camptown hospitals, and she treats camptown prostitutes. She works in orphanages, and she cares for abandoned children, including the abandoned mixed-race children of Korean women and U.S. GIs. None of this endears the U.S. military to her, right? The commander, not lying, but kind of irresponsible in her view, right? The soldiers with the abandoned children, abandoned women, the prostitutes, she says, no, they all point fingers at the women. But what have the women done, right? They haven't sinned. She's Christian, so she speaks in this Christian language, right? They haven't sinned. Their only sin is poverty and trying to make a living, right? What about these soldiers, right? They're sinning all over the place, right? Lust and violence and murder and et cetera. Right? So she has very, very clear opinions and a very clear negative opinion of the U.S. military, right? But she ends up coming to the United States, right? Because pretty much her entire life she has this recurring dream where she's standing across at one side of a very thick black river. It's kind of dusk. On the other side are 3 children calling out, "Omani, Omani," and she can't stand this, right? And she thinks, well, maybe if I go across the ocean, leave this peninsula, right, this cursed peninsula, I can leave all of this grief and all of these memories behind, right? So in the 1970s, she gets a job as a nurse, goes to California, and she starts a new life. But what she told me was, there's no way to escape your own history, right? Those dreams, they have wings. They follow you across the ocean. It's not funny, but she actually laughed when she was talking about that. And so I would argue for her that, the military, she's not a soldier, but the military plays a major role in pushing her out of Korea into the United States as an immigrant. This last person I'm going to talk about, Reverend Yuh, was a teenager during the Korean War. And he recounts his memory of the war breaking out, going around the villages, wandering around the villages, hearing the news, and hearing that, the North has gone all the way down south to Busan, et cetera, and so forth. And he's like, oh, well, this war is kind of interesting. The North seems to be winning. But then, right, MacArthur lands at Incheon, and things change. And so he talks about that change.
그동안에 보면 말이야. 유효가 나와줘서 그 10월 중순께쯤에서 인민군이 후퇴하면서 유엔군하고 국군이 들어올 때 그 전에는 밤낮으로 그때는 지금은 뭐 스텔스 bom이라고 하지만 B-52 스텔스 bom이라고 하지만 그때는 가장 최신형이 B-29 이 폭격기라 이것이 밤낮으로 와서 폭탄을 터뜨린 거야. 수없는 폭탄을 터뜨리는 거야. 그러니까 밤에는 은율, 사리원, 저 진양포 거기가 환해. 항상 폭탄을 터뜨리고 그리고 이 조명탄하고 이제 캄캄하니까 그 조명을 하기 위해서 이 불을 이렇게 밝히기 위해서 불을 낙하산을 떨어뜨리니까 그걸 조명탄이라고 그러더라고. 그걸 영어는 뭐라 하는지 몰라 그래요. 그걸 떨어뜨리면 그냥 그 사방 수백 미터에 난 밝은 거야. 그냥 대낮같이 밝아. 그러고서는 그거 떨어뜨리고 난 다음에 그냥 폭탄이 떨어지는 거야. 뭐 그냥 수없이 떨어지는 거야. 그리고는 바다가 이제 황야 바다가 저쪽에 있으니까 바다에서는 그 분화하면서 포를 쏘는 거야. 그러니까 폭탄 떨어뜨리지 포쏘지. 그러니까 밤낮 땅굴에 가서 숨어 있어야 되는 거야. 말 못해. 그건 정말 말 못해. 사실 미국 사람들이 이 9월 11일 사건 그건 아무도 아니야. 사람들이 폭탄에 맞아서 쓰러지는 장면의 눈을 다 봤으니까.
So in his narrative, it's not just the U.S. military that's responsible for killing so many people, right? The North Korean army killed many people, as many as they could, he said, as they retreated, right, on suspicion of, disloyalties. The South Korean army, when they advanced into the north, did the same as they advanced. And so between the two armies, they managed to kill off entire families, right? He recalls digging a hole by the side of an outhouse to hide, right? And he even laughs, somewhat grimly, noting that no one thought to look right by an outhouse, right? They didn't think that anybody would hide right by an outhouse. Now, notice that no army comes off looking good here. The U.S. is bombing and throwing cannons at quiet villages and terrorizing civilians with their B-29s and their flares and their cannons. Both Korean armies are massacring people left and right. The pun is very much intended. Armies are associated in his mind with death and destruction, right? Literally hellfire falling from the skies. Right? Eventually, he and his family are able to board a U.S. military ship and sail down the western coast of Korea. They're supposed to go all the way around, probably to Jeojedo, but instead, the ship hits something and they end up landing at Kunsan. And there, there's a refugee camp, the family's at the refugee camp. Eventually, they make their way over to Gimpo, which is a small suburb on the west side of Seoul, which at that time ended up becoming sort of a settlement point for a lot of northerners. He leaves the family in the refugee camp, right, and just disappears, right? His sister tells me the story and says, the family was like, where did he go? Right? He's this teenager, right? He's never really been off on his own. He comes from a very large, land-owning, extremely rich family in the north. Doesn't know the world, doesn't know how to work. He went off. He's gone. Like, where is he? And he comes back, right? This is a story that his sister tells. And in that story that his sister tells, it's a story of the coddled child, right? Transformed into a man who takes care of his family, right? Saves them, rescues them from starvation. It's a kind of coming-of-age story. And she talks with a lot of pride and self-satisfaction about how he shows up with literally sackfuls of stuff, right? Canned meats, cheese, flour, rice, noodles, all kinds of things, even chocolates, she said, right? During his disappearance, it turned out, he worked for the Americans on base, on the Kunsan base nearby, right? And so he worked, earned money, and brought his family back these goods, right? Now, Reverend Yuh himself tells a completely different story, right? In fact, he never once told me the story of his food-laden return to his family, right? Instead, he talks about the time he spent on base, right? About toting up to soldiers to get work and the resulting tips, about getting a job manning the soldiers' lounge, right? About eating nothing but the sugar that falls off the donuts that he sold, right? Because they counted the donuts to make sure how many he sold, how many were left, but the sugar, nobody counted the sugar, right? So he would spend days literally surviving on nothing but water and sugar, right? He would talk about the flicker of shame that he felt as he saw the Camptown prostitutes, right? The constant hunger, and just the sheer jaw-dropping amazement at the power and the waste that the Americans indulged in, right? And what he leaves unsaid, I fill in, right? Why is he eating sugar for days? He's getting paid, right? He's eating sugar for days because he's saving up all that money so he can buy stuff at the PX to take back to his family at the refugee camp, right? He's too young to fight in the Korean War, and by the time he does his mandatory military service, it's in the late 1950s. His dominant memory of his military service is that every single thing, even, he said, whether or not you flush the toilet, right, had to be approved with paperwork in triplicate by the U.S. military, right? That not even the highest Korean commander was able to do anything without the approval of some American somewhere in Korea, right? And that's actually historically true, right? Because until the 1990s, the supreme commander of the South Korean military forces was the U.S. military commander, right? And although that changed in the late 90s to allow the South Koreans to control their own army, that control automatically reverts to the United States in the event of the outbreak of war, right? So this is not a sovereign army, right? And for him, this experience brings home to him that Korea is not only divided, right, in half, but also remains colonized, right? Because he's saying, no, how could a nation be sovereign? Right? I don't like armies, I don't like the military, but how could a nation be sovereign if their own military is not theirs to control, right? And so his experience as a soldier, his experience as a war refugee, these are all very alienating for him, right? He feels very little affinity for governmental authorities, right? And immigrating in the early 1970s only accentuates that, right? So he comes to see both the northern and southern governments as rather questionable, a view he still holds today. In South Korea in the 1960s, that's an untenable political position for a young man to hold, right? You're not going to get a job. You're not going to be allowed to teach, right? It's not going to work, right? And so he goes to the United States, right, ironically, to study, and ended up staying. So this, of course, is a major reason for his international migration, but he goes further, right? He doesn't allow himself to have the luxury of saying, well, the U.S.-Korea military relationship had forced my migration, right? He's much more brutally honest, right? He says, being away from his hometown, being a northerner in the South, he's rootless, doesn't have social connections. That's a problem, right? And because he was young and full of dreams, right? Part of him wants to take advantage of what the world has to offer rather than staying in a small backwater of a country, right? So he says, there are ways in which he was selfish. Right? He was selfish about his own personal advancement as opposed to staying in his country and sticking it out, right? Now, these are the motivations that he lists. They're common to anybody who surveys immigration. So what I want to point out is that, again, for him, his military experience isn't a positive one. It doesn't bind him to any group with some kind of loyalty. And just to reiterate that the historical circumstances for Koreans in the mid-20th century, right, simply do not make it easy, right, to build or construct the kind of connections to hold between individuals and a governmental collective, right? Instead, it really leaves it ripe for negative military experiences, for coerced military experiences that lead to alienation from governmental authorities, right? Leads to a kind of fear of governmental authorities. And rather than building and constructing citizenship, right, may in some ways work toward kind of weakening, right, and tearing down citizenship. So this is just a sort of a long-winded way of saying what I'm trying to do right now is think about, clearly the idea of citizenship and its relationship to military participation is complicated, and we need to rethink it. Right? And so these are my first kind of fumbling steps toward trying to rethink that. Thank you.